This video is sponsored by Squarespace. So we're at the mid-season break, 14 races down, 10 to go. Will the team championship go down to the line? Probably. The drivers, still a long shot, but you never know. Thing is, there's been a fair bit of talk recently about the point system we have. The F1 Commission unanimously agreed to not change the system last week after rumoured consideration of giving points to the top 12 instead of the top 10. Well, that got me thinking, what if the system was entirely different? What if we could have a system that is more representative of the championship order that we actually have? I decided to look over the Atlantic for some inspiration to everybody's favourite red flag fest, INDYCAR. It has a very different approach to points allocation than F1, and trust me, it mixes things up. My name's Tommo. Let's talk about it. Alright, let's start with a few caveats, okay? This is a bit of fun, first and foremost, but I do think it does go to show how the simple changing of an arbitrary number that's put next to your finishing position can actually change the order, and how a lot of these drivers, their performances are perceived. Teams would of course do things differently as well if every position offered points. You'd strategize differently, you'd fight more potentially for places that you wouldn't necessarily go absolute Hail Mary. Psychologically, it's going to make a difference if P16 actually gives points versus right now when it doesn't. I've also had to modify INDYCAR's system ever so slightly because of course in F1 there's only 20 starters to any given race. In Indy, you can have over 30. There were 33 starters in this year's Indy 500. INDYCAR also gives 5 points to every single finisher from P25 downwards. Even if they DNF, you also get a point for pole position like they do in Formula 2, which is cool. We're going to keep that. They also give you a point if you've led at least a lap, and 2 points to whoever's led the most laps, which I cannot be asked to factor into this equation, so we're ignoring that. The adjustment I'm making doesn't really affect the points up front though, so P1 gets 50 points, P2 40, P3 35, P4 32, and so on all the way down to P19 who get 2 points, P20, I'm sorry, we're doing nil points. And what about sprints ruining the stats as per usual? Well, of course, the INDYCAR system has 50 points for a win, F1 has 25, basically double, so I'm just going to double it here as well. So 16 points for a sprint win instead of 8, going down in increments of 2 until you get to P8 with 2 points. That's basically it. I'll explain anything more I have to as we go, but before we get into it, a quick word from today's video sponsor, Squarespace. If you want to build a beautiful bespoke online home, be that for an e-com business, a blog, a portfolio, doesn't matter, Squarespace is the place to go. Made even easy with their brand new guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint. Choose from tons of professionally curated layouts and styling options to build a unique online presence from the ground up, tailored to your brand or business and optimized for every device. I've been using Squarespace for years. It's free to try as well. You can play around with it. If you don't want to go ahead, you don't have to. But I reckon you will, and when you do want to publish your finished website live to the world, why don't you go to squarespace.com/TOMMO'F1 to get 10% off of your very first website or domain. So here's how the F1 points were after round 1 this year, Bahrain. Red Bull 1-2, good points for Ferrari as well, and Zhou Guanyu being the unfortunate beneficiary of P11, the highest position where you don't score a point. Now, of course, in the constructors, that did mean that Sauber was sitting P6, still on 0 points, but best finishing position of everyone on equal points. That's kind of how they work it out. So they're P6. And maximum points for Red Bull, including that fastest lap point, which is in F1, but you don't get a fastest lap point in INDYCAR. That comes in qualifying. So yes, let's change the system. Now, of course, the driver's finishing order does not change, but the points allocated do, and every single driver scores points. Apart from Logan. Sorry, Logan. This isn't the first, and unfortunately this won't be the last for him. So again, no change here, but when you move to the constructors order, it does change, because Daniel and Yuki's P13 and 14 respectively actually accumulated more points in the INDYCAR system than Zhou's P11 plus Valtteri's P19. I think you can already tell this is going to affect mainly the teams towards the bottom, but don't worry, the teams up front are not immune to changes either. Let's skip ahead to post race 7, 50% of the first half of the season or 25% of the entire season. post Imola Grand Prix. Max has just converted another win, closely chased down by Lando Norris at the death. Verstappen's gap to a strong Charles Leclerc, sitting at 48 points. 5 drivers still yet to score all season. Ollie Behrman sitting P12, having converted those 6 points in Saudi Arabia, filling in for Carlos Sainz. Williams and Sauber still sit pointless in the Constructors, and Alpine off the marks, with Esteban Ocon converting that P10 in the Miami round 6 race. Red Bull looking reasonably comfortable for this point in the season, but McLaren's momentum is now starting to build now that Lando's finally got that win done. So how does the INDYCAR point system change things up? Well, the biggest casualty by far is a certain Mr. Oliver Behrman. He's absolutely shafted, dropping from P12 to P21. That's the problem with everyone scoring points. Even though he's bagged big points in that race in Saudi, well, even Logan's managed to outscore him. The Haas boys gained big time too, gained 3 positions each. By this stage, 7 races into the season, Nico had managed 3 P11s and Kev managed 3 P12s, which of course in the F1 system scored them 0 points, but in the INDYCAR system they all bank. That sees Haas swap with Racing Bulls in the Constructors, and also Sauber jump Williams, even though in real life Williams was sitting ahead of Sauber because Alex managed 2 P11 finishes. So no big changes here, but again I just think generally speaking across the board the relative gap between teams and drivers is just a little bit more representative of what actually happened on track. But before we jump ahead to where things stand after 14 races, I thought it'd be interesting to look at, we've already looked at those first 7 races, let's look at the second 7 races in isolation. Who's got the momentum basically? So when you're only looking from round 8 Monaco to round 14 Belgium, Max Verstappen still sits atop of the title, but he's only 6 points clear of Oscar Piastri. And again, this is in an INDYCAR system where it's 50 points for a race win and 40 points for P2, so that's basically nothing. And then Lewis Hamilton is another 6 points back from Oscar. So the top 3 covered by 12 points, which is an equivalent to about 6 points in this in our system. Obviously Lewis getting the wins in Silverstone and of course over George in Spa, Oscar getting his win in Hungary. Charles was sitting 1 point behind George, even with George's disqualification. It's really been a difficult last 7 races for Charles Leclerc, hasn't it? Tough, but not as tough as Checo's, who actually outscored by Daniel Ricciardo, which is not only very bad, but also maybe foreshadowing. But then when you convert all of these points into a constructors table, damn, Red Bull aren't even second. They're third behind both McLaren and Mercedes. And you got to say McLaren 503 points should be on more. Like the points left on the table by McLaren messing up strategy and Lando unfortunately making mistakes is tough. Ferrari's fall off is pretty clear. Alpine and Haas only split by 4 points, and Racing Bull's actually pretty close to Aston Martin. So finally we have our current state, 14 of 24 complete. Max of course in real life has a 78 point gap advantage over Lando Norris. The Saubers are still yet to score, and Ollie Behrman is holding on to P14 for dear life, which is, I think that's actually higher than where he is in F2, isn't it? Mercedes have found some momentum, of course, as of late, but they still sit 79 points behind a struggling Ferrari, and McLaren just 42 behind Red Bull. Well, by far and away the biggest winners from this more representative INDYCAR style point system is Esteban Ocon and Valtteri Bottas. Both gained 3 positions each, so of course Ocon's managed 3 P10s and a P9, which don't give a lot of points. However, that consistency of getting up there rewards him much more appropriately, I think, in this system. And the same for Valtteri. He's stone dead last in the real championship, which is crazy because he's been much better than Joe. Joe banked that P11 in Bahrain early doors, hasn't really done anything since, and Bottas definitely merits being further up the championship, certainly ahead of Sargent. But then what about more towards the front? Because as you can see, Oscar, Charles, Lewis and Carlos are all kind of switching places. But to be honest, if you had to tell me to guess the championship order without actually knowing, I probably would put Hamilton ahead of Sainz, just instinctively. Maybe Oscar over Charles. I know that's very recency bias and Charles had a good start to the year, but I probably feel that way. And that's reflected here. I mean, Oscar's got like a 25 point gap to Charles in the INDYCAR system, which again, to equate it to the F1 is like half that, like 12.5 points. But also Max's gap to Lando at the front is interesting. Again, as things stand, it's 78 points in real life, which is basically Lando getting 3 race wins with maximum points and Max DNFing and not scoring anything. But with Indy's system, that gap is more like 2.5 wins with Max not scoring anything. However, of course, because everyone gets points, it's much easier for Max to still score points even if he has a stinker. So I guess that kind of balances out. So yeah, what do you think? Do you think this Indy points system is better? The argument I hear most is it takes away what is special about scoring points, and certainly, you know, it's a big deal to teams getting P10 when they're a mile back. However, I would argue as well, there's not really those minnows in F1 like there used to be, who would celebrate a P10, a point scoring finish, like they've won a race. I mean, maybe Sauber, but I don't think they're going to score a point, to be honest, all season. Either way, let me know in the comments below. Drop a like if you enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you're new and you want to see more. My name's Tommo. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.